So Scottish Interfaith Week is our national festival of faith, started by Interfaith Scotland in 2004, and next year will be our 20th anniversary. Every year we have a different theme for the week, and this year our theme is community. 2 years ago, our theme was Together for the Planet, as Scottish Interfaith Week coincided with COP26. The international conference where the governments of the world come together to explore what can be done to save our planet. COP26 was in Glasgow, and after a full week of amazing interfaith and climate-related activities, we were able to continue our interfaith climate work in diverse ways, chairing the Scottish Interfaith Climate Justice Network, working with the Interfaith Liaison Committee to the UN, attending meetings of the Scottish Government relating to the climate, and thank you, Adrian, who's been going to quite a few of those meetings on our behalf, working with the religious leaders of Scotland and others to issue statements relating to different aspects of the crisis, and planting trees in our World Interfaith Harmony Grove in the Highlands of Scotland. This year it will be COP28, and the Conference of the Parties, or COP, will be held in Dubai in a few weeks' time. And so it felt very pertinent and important to have a conversation with communities and individuals during Scottish Interfaith Week that kept our faith communities and friends talking about the climate crisis and how we could all play our part. So I am delighted to have two wonderful climate activists with us tonight to lead us in our conversation. And Bonnie will now introduce them to you, and we look forward to our engagement with them and with all of you.
Thank you, Maureen. Well, good evening, everyone. I'm the convener of the Interfaith Relations Committee for the Scottish Episcopal Church, but I have also had a passion for environmental awareness for ever so long. As this week was being planned, I thought it an ideal opportunity to bring together both of these interests, especially as COP26 highlighted just how many faith communities have been involved. What a powerful change we could bring about working together. I'd hoped that our lead bishop on climate change in the Scottish Episcopal Church, Bishop Ian Payton, who's from the Diocese of St. Andrews, Dunkeld and Dunblane, would be able to share the work that we're doing. Unfortunately, he's had a severe chest infection and was unable to join us. But we do have Paul Williams with us, whose role it is to guide the Scottish Episcopal Church forward in confronting climate change. So I'd like to introduce him, but also, and after I do so, I'd like to introduce Zarina Ahmed, who will be responding to Paul. So Paul moved to Scotland to work for the Scottish Wildlife Trust, where he traveled around Scotland managing wildlife reserves. And he volunteered for Christian conservation charity Arosha, UK, where he interned with a community church in Postle Park, Glasgow, to connect local people with their green space, and then went on to support climate change project at the Church of Scotland. Paul worked ecumenically with Eco Congregation Scotland, developing new partnerships, and his project Faith Action for Nature brought together church and conservation communities for the restoration of Scottish ecosystems. It was recognized by the United Nations Environment Programme for its pioneering demonstration of collaboration between faith groups and biodiversity conservation. Paul is responsible for steering the implementation of the Net Zero Action Plan of the Scottish Episcopal Church by providing guidance and resources to dioceses and churches, national partners, and translating the information gathered from the Net Zero Toolkit, which he'll outline for us this evening, into actionable measures. And then, of course, we have Zarina Ahmed, who will be responding to Paul. She is a PhD scholar at the University of Manchester, researching environmental sustainability of individuals from underrepresented groups in society. Zarina has 15 years experience in climate change and climate justice, providing bespoke training programs across different sectors. One of the mighty women on Women's Hour's 2020 Our Planet Power list, Zarina previously worked at the Council for Ethnic Minority Voluntary Organisations, leading the charge for increasing participation in environmentalism in Scotland. Since being told that ethnic minorities aren't interested in climate change, Zarina has dedicated herself to creating pathways for underrepresented groups to work in environmental organization. Zarina has created spaces for marginalized women's voices to be heard about climate issues, Climate Sisters, who exhibit their creative work at various venues such as the Glasgow Science Centre, the Universities of Glasgow and Edinburgh. So I'll turn over to the two of you, turning to Paul first, but thank you. I'm really looking forward to this.
So yes, thank you very much. I feel like I don't have a career quite as illustrious as others in the Zoom room, but I shall do my best to make up for the absence of Bishop Ian and talk a bit about the climate action in the Scottish Episcopal Church. As is mentioned, my role is very much on the delivery side of net zero and the action plan that was agreed. So I'll be talking quite a lot about the practical aspects of that and what that is involved in this process. So to begin with, then, I thought it was worth mentioning or asking the question, what is net zero? Because it's one of those quite loosely defined terms that's bandied around and very rarely pinned down. So essentially what we're looking at for our purposes is the balancing of greenhouse gas emissions with their removal from the atmosphere. And that can happen at many different levels. It can happen at an individual level, but also at an organizational level, national and indeed global. So I'll be talking about that in an organizational capacity for the Scottish Episcopal Church. In terms of defining net zero, we also need to define boundaries. So really understanding what we can control in terms of our emissions and what we can't, and then to work out a strategy after that in how you achieve those emissions reductions. So the way that the Greenhouse Gas Protocol defines emissions is in 3 scopes, and very briefly covering those in scope 1 are the direct emissions that would be from an organization's operations, and those are generally something like your boiler. So if you're running a gas boiler, you're producing emissions, you're burning emissions on site and burning fossil fuels on site and producing emissions. So that would be a scope 1 emission. Scope 2 emissions are the indirect burning of fossil fuels. So that would be if you are purchasing electricity that is sourced from a fossil fuel powered power station. Those are also your emissions and you are responsible for them as an organization. Scope 3 are the indirect emissions, which is largely everything else that isn't those things. So all the other emissions from the running of your organization, the purchasing that you have, where you hold your investments, all those sorts of things, they also fall under that kind of larger category at the end. So the plan for the Scottish Episcopal Church is we started out looking at, what do we have control over? Where are the quick wins? Where can we start making progress? And where do we need to develop the plan? And so looking at those, what's within our control. And the plan determined that was that we would start with scope 1 and 2 emissions and then move on to scope 3 emissions, travel emissions specifically, as part of that process in the first stage of the plan. And then scope 3 would be the focus after 2030, when we would start looking at more of the in-depth supply chain operations, day-to-day emissions and such. So what I'll be mainly talking about is dealing with scope 1 and 2 emissions and scope 3 travel emissions in our plan currently. The plan itself, it's called the 2023 to 2030 plan. That's because it's to engage with those main 2 emissions first and emission scope 3 later. It's essentially just our plan to reduce church emissions between now and 2030. In its simplest form, that's really what it is. It was created through a consultation process that was ran, I think this is before I joined the Episcopal Church, but I believe that this was during the springtime of this year. And then it was approved by the General Synod in June. So it's a plan that's relatively fresh off the press. And it's essentially the church's response to climate change in saying that we agree that emissions need to come down, we need a plan for achieving this, and the Net Zero Action Plan is that response. Naturally, the plan is based in Christian values. So those are the discipleship, which is to live out the teaching of Jesus in our everyday lives. Justice, recognizing that our fossil fuel powered lifestyle is having a devastating impact on the poorest communities in the world. And hope, the Christian hope of a world filled with, provision of hope in a world filled with suffering and despair. So I'm not going to go into the full details of what this plan entails, but it can be summarized in this nice pretty picture here, which are the 10 petals of the plan, which is the way we can categorize the different approaches that we have. So the first is a section of the plan on energy efficiency improvements. That's looking very practically at our buildings and determining where we can make improvements, where we need insulation, where we can lower the demand, the energy demand of a building, and the associated emissions of that. Clean energy, that's about the scope 2 emissions that I mentioned earlier. That's about changing your energy suppliers to renewable energy, or perhaps having on-site electricity generation via solar panels, and so moving away from purchasing any energy that comes from fossil fuels and the emissions associated with that. The plan also recognizes the other crisis, the twin crisis of biodiversity collapse and the biodiversity crisis. So the plan includes elements that involve that in tandem as well. Then active travel, looking at how we can reduce the emissions associated with travel, as I mentioned earlier, moving away from fossil fuel-based combustion and encouraging the uptake of active travel or electric vehicles as well. Zero waste, I feel like probably for this group that's fairly self-explanatory. So let's just move on to the next one. Shared governance. This one I think is particularly significant because it's the part of the plan that recognizes that this isn't just a plan that's sort of developed at a high level, agreed at the General Synod, and then goes and sits on a shelf. It actually articulates how this is going to be divided up and the different responsibilities that various areas of the church have to make this a joint effort and shared governance over the Net Zero Action Plan. Training and education focuses on the training and education for those that are going to work in the church, and how that training needs to change to reflect changing times. Similar to that is also the rooted in worship, so how church communities worship and contextualizing creation care and the fifth mark of mission, and the general environmental response within the worship communities as well, and places of worship. None of this plan would be possible if we didn't have a means of funding it and paying for it. And so there's a whole section of the plan that identifies where we can acquire funding and trying to help pay for all of the things that we want to do in this plan. And lastly, but not least, the 10th petal is building a movement, and that recognizes what essentially all the other petals are when they come together, which is that we need culture change within the organization, and we need to change the fundamental ways in which we operate to really transform into a low carbon or zero carbon organization. So where do we start then? We have this grand plan, we have all these petals, we have pretty flowers and such, but what does this actually mean in practice? And that's really where my job comes into the picture here. And it begins really with informing communities. And as was mentioned earlier, we have the Net Zero Toolkit. So this is an online resource that was published in September. It's a work in progress in the sense that we'll be constantly adding to this resource, but it begins by helping provide kind of small little bite-sized pieces of information and ideas for church communities to explore what they can do in their buildings and where they should start their thinking, and just little appetizers, I suppose, on the net zero journey. Following on from that and working alongside those, we've produced a physical deck of cards, which we call the Net Zero cards, which can be which churches can get hold of, and they can run those in their own workshops with those or with their environmental groups. And that's a really a malleable way of moving things around a table and deciding what your priorities should be for your community and for your building. For those that want to take a kind of a bigger chunk and get a bit more committed, or have maybe done the first two actions on informing themselves, they might decide, actually, yes, we're ready now for a net zero workshop. And these are things that we're providing at the moment as well. churches are able to sign up for workshops provided in partnership with an organization called Heat Hack. And they really do a deep dive into the operation of a building. So they look at when it's open, when it's closed, when it's heated, when it's not, which areas of the building need to be heated, where heat is being lost, a full understanding, almost like an equivalent of an MOT for a building in some ways. So those workshops are designed to be done with the people that use the building and manage the building and run the finances for the building, so that then you have the basis of a really informative plan for what you can do with the building and what the long-term plans should be. Encapsulating all of that, we're pursuing carbon literacy training with the Carbon Literacy Trust. So we're commissioning our own carbon literacy training to be run throughout the organisation, and initially that'll be led for the senior leadership in the church, and so that will inform decision making, and so there will be climate literacy across all the decisions that we make henceforth. And that's really significant because, I mean, I suppose you could call it carbon literacy if you don't know what that means. You could call it climate justice training, you could call it climate literacy training. It's understanding climate change in the context of the decisions that you might be making as an organization. And so that's a crucial part of the process in developing the behavior change that we need at the decision-making level. After that then, so that's all the informing part, and now we need to actually start delivering some of these things. And these are some of the things these are the more of the hopefuls that we're moving towards next. We are currently recruiting a net zero team because we need people to be able to provide advice and guidance to church communities. So these are individuals who will be able to pick up the phone, and when a church calls and the church says, we've done our workshop, what do we do next? The net zero team will be able to pick that up and say, right, these are the people you need to get in touch with, these are the surveys and the audits that you need to get done for your property, and so on and so forth, and wherever those conversations might lead. Naturally, funding, part of the team's role will also be helping communities apply for funding, be that Scottish Government funding or exploring opportunities from local funding or other funding trusts in order to help pay for some of the project work that they might be seeking to do. We ourselves are looking at our own grants, so looking at our own investments internally and determining where we can draw funds out to provide grant funding to communities. One such example is we're looking at grant funding for active travel, so encouraging clergy to give up vehicles, combustion vehicles, and move towards active travel or electric vehicles, and we're actively exploring that at the moment. And lastly, we need measurement tools. We want to provide measurement tools for churches so that they can have ownership over their emissions and they can see their emissions coming down, and just give them a sense of ownership in the sense that they can see progress and they can measure themselves against others in the organization. So exploring developing measurement tools for that as well. So lastly, having kind of raced through very quickly what the net zero plan is, the obvious question is, there's lots of terminology that bounces around, and is net zero a path to climate justice? Well, net zero is not the silver bullet. It's essentially about climate mitigation. So for the purposes of climate change, it's really good at measuring our progress on climate action. But really, it only gets us halfway to climate justice. And the reason I believe that is because net zero doesn't factor in loss and damage. I tail that off with a dotted line because I think that the next stage of net zero, as it evolves as a relatively new term in climate change movement, I think that there is scope in which net zero can involve loss and damage, and it can go one step further. But at the moment, it doesn't. It only does half the job. So yes, and that involves actually the way in which we utilize net zero to transform our economies away from destruction towards restoration. And so I just want to close with this final slide, which is also the picture that I started with, in that the way I think that we need to move forward in our approach to net zero, whether we call it net zero or whether we call it something else, and whether that term changes in a number of years' time, is that we fundamentally need to change the way that we approach our economies. For the last 30 years or so, we've been building in the direction of destruction, that we've been destroying our way through the planet. More recently, we've been started to think about we've been building away from despair. As climate change becomes more more obvious and we're more afraid of it. We're trying to build our way out of a problem. But crucially, I think it needs to go one step further, and it needs to change again. And that is to actually build towards hope and provide a hopeful future that we can build to. And that transforms the whole way that we need to think about climate change in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was really interesting. I was in my head, I was going, okay, we're here again. We were here 10 years ago. We were here 20 years ago. It was just termed differently. And so it was no different than doing a climate challenge funded project with churches. And this is the same methodology, the same process. But then you moved on to talking about like net zero being only halfway, and it was about mitigation. And you acknowledge the fact that there's still a lot to do with connecting it to climate justice. And you mentioned loss and damage, and I'm not sure if everybody knows what loss and damage is. So, Paul, would you be able to expand a little bit about loss and damage for us?
Yes. So I suppose it's a term that's more commonly used in climate justice circles, but essentially it's loss and damage. We didn't really talk about loss and damage until quite recently, because we have been working towards trying to mitigate the effects of climate change so that the impacts of climate change are not so severe. Unfortunately, we didn't act quickly enough 30 years ago. And so now communities all across the world are suffering loss and damage as a result of climate change. And that's already happening. And there are, the highest consuming nations are primarily responsible because of their impact on the planet. So loss and damage is the term that we use to recognize essentially the burden that others have borne as a result of climate change that is primarily not their fault.
So it's very similar to the concept and the principles of climate justice. However, the difference here is, I suppose, there's a monetary value put on it, so that there's like a penalty and you have to pay. Is that right?
For loss and damage, do you mean?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So
I mean,
loss and so loss and damage, I suppose, if we talk about how it's discussed in COP, there's the establishment of a loss and damage fund, which states are encouraged to put funding into, and that is to pay for, I suppose, compensation in some is one term, and there's other terms that are used, but to use those funds to help support the communities that have been displaced or suffered damage as a result of climate change.
Thank you. And the other question, because we've been here before, and it's always about engaging communities and getting people to take responsibility, but also when we talk about net zero, we're talking about a physical place, we talk about a church, an institution, but it's more about the physical aspect of it, like the infrastructure. So you're talking a lot about energy efficiency of the building, thinking about where the energy comes from and green energy. But what I'm really interested in is actually the leadership from within the church, because when we look at COP, there is a good representation of religious leaders there. So I was just wondering, what do you see the role of religious leaders in taking climate action, and what kind of spaces should they step into? Should it be more about engaging more with civic society engagement? Should it be more about political change? Should it be more about activism? Should it be about divestment? So where do you think that leadership is lacking? Where could it be stronger?
There's a lot of questions inside.
This could be a personal opinion.
There's a lot of questions inside that question, and I wouldn't say that I have an answer other than to say that I'll give you some of my thinking, so you can join me as I think through this process. So I think first of all, I think the concept of leadership is interesting in the question to begin with, because essentially the way leadership works in any particular role is in many ways it's down to a person's ability to persuade. So how effective are they at persuading a group, their powers of persuasion, and how people respond to them. And in a faith community, you'll have faith leaders who, when they speak, there is a community that is listening to them, that is looking to them for leadership. And oftentimes I think broadly within the environmental movement, we confuse leadership in one area to be just as effective as leadership in another area. And so we think that, I suppose you see this in economic settings, where you see that people who are very good business leaders think they're going to make great politicians, and then when they go and be politicians, there's a whole different audience, and so their leadership, they don't have leadership in that space. And so when it comes to this specific issue, I think individual religious leaders have a lot of influence and persuasive ability within their organizations, but is that transferable when they move, which is I guess the body of your question, is that how transferable is that when they move into a different sector? And I think that some of that comes down to terminology, in terms of once you translate into a different sector, you now need to engage differently, because you might not be a leader in a political space like you are in a religious space, in which case, how do you interact in that space that is different? You are now somebody who goes to listen rather than somebody who goes to persuade. So I think there's a lot of that that's very interesting in there. Crucially, I think where leadership works best, where there's ambiguity about the effectiveness of your leadership and ability of persuasion, is when you come together, is when religious leaders come together, as they do in COP, because then it's not about the individual leaders' persuasive ability or inspirational ability, but rather what they represent and the groups that they represent. And I think that's when moving into politics and the political space and something like COP, they carry much more influence than they do as individuals. I'll hand back to you in case you want to elaborate on that.
No, and it's interesting because, like you say, in that political space, and I find that sometimes in the UK, we think that UK is a very secular country, right? And politics and religions don't mix, right? But I would probably argue that that's not the case, because we're all political with a small p, and we all have a voice, whether we're from a religious institute, a religious body. So we should be using that voice for positive, greater good for everybody. So that's why I asked that question quite a lot, because it's like, oh, we can't talk about religion within the political sphere, but yet we can't talk about religion when we talk about environmentalism as well. So with environmentalism, it's like we shy away about bringing religion and religious drivers into that space, and it's still a struggle. But I think in Scotland we are moving in the right direction. So thinking about that, the other question I wanted to ask is if you could give us a little bit more about your vision for and I'm going to use your term, net zero, which, like you said, that these terms change all the time, and it could be net zero now, it'll be something else next week. But what would your vision be for a net zero world, nation? It doesn't even have to be a world, it could be like smaller nation, community. And who is needed to get there for that vision to happen? Who would you bring along to get that vision?
These are great questions. They're such big questions, aren't they? I think I think it alludes to what I was saying at the end of the presentation, is that we have net zero that only goes halfway, which means net zero can't be a solution if it doesn't address the grievances that have already been caused as a result of climate change. So I think the way we achieve net zero properly has got to include loss and damage finance in some capacity. But I think, again, loss and damage, because it's quite a political term, politicians are very reluctant to go near it, because it's an admission of guilt on behalf of the nation. If you say, yes, we're going to put forward loss and damage funding, you are then, as a nation, admitting guilt. Now, we would say that they probably should, because that's kind of the whole point of climate justice. But politically, that's very, very uncomfortable. And so actually changing the terminology and the way that we approach it means that we can achieve loss and damage funding through net zero, which is a politically acceptable term, and everyone's quite happy with the ambiguity of net zero. So that we can achieve that through net zero finance, but we'll just have to call it something else so that the politicians are happy with it and that the economists are happy with it. And I think what that actually looks like is that essentially what we have at the moment is we have large companies. It's mainly large companies more than countries, but large countries and companies that are falling over themselves to try and work out how to do net zero. So they want to decarbonize. They also want to keep the fossil fuel lobby happy, but they also want to buy up tracts of land all over the world to plant trees and try and start sucking carbon back out of the atmosphere. Now, it's not thought through, and we know that, and it's all being rushed, and it currently doesn't make any sense. But what net zero, to get it to work, is that actually we can be decarbonizing in one place, and we can be restoring and we can be rebuilding in other places. And if there are places that are suffering, that have suffered loss and damage from climate change, then those are the places that desperately need to be restored and rebuilt. We need to restore those cultures, we need to restore those ecosystems, and there's net zero finance being spent on planting monoculture forests all over the world. So we can make this happen. Humanity is capable of fixing this problem. We just need to take our thinking a little bit further and start gluing some of these things together in a more sensible way, and a way that is actually just as well.
Yeah, and I love what you said about like restoring the places of that damage. But then I'm a cynic, right? and the first thing that came to my head when you said that was, but who would benefit from that restoration? And we have to be careful, because like you said, it would be for the people of that land, that area, and it would benefit them. But the worry always is whose vision, whose input, whose say when that restoration happens. And that has to be done in a just way. And again, and this is where I think that it's very important for like communities and faith leaders to step up and be there and to say, hold it, stop. This isn't all about GDP. You know, this has to be more than about economics here. So yeah, so I hope you carry on doing all that wonderful great work of making sure that the justice part is at the heart of everything that does, and it's not about economic financial gain, which is really important. And I was on a call yesterday, and this is and somebody was speaking to me about some of the challenges that churches have. So they were talking about food and a food bank, and I know that your work isn't about food and food justice, but it's what is the pressure like for a church to be financially feasible? Is that getting worse at the moment? I mean, is there pressure that the churches have to make money in a way?
I'll just come on to that point in a second, because I wanted to mention your point about religious leaders involved. I think that when it comes to the delivery of loss and damage finance, whatever mechanisms there might be, there's lots of suggestions in the way that it should be done. I'm no expert on the economics of that. But if displaced communities and communities that have lost everything, what's the one thing they can take with them? If they have faith and they have their faith, their faith is the one thing they can take with them when they're displaced. And so if that's all that's left from a community that's been destroyed by whatever it might be, whether it's a slow onset drought or a hurricane, it's the faith leaders who will be there with those people who will say, we now have that position of representation, and those are the people who can help, will rebuild, because that's the one thing you have left to rebuild on, because perhaps everything else is gone. And now because I've answered that question, I've forgotten the last one. So can you just remind me of your second one after that? So how a church is going to resource kind of net zero and decarbonizing, is that right, with the funding?
Yeah, how much pressure are they on that they have to make sure that they're financially feasible, like as in financially viable? Is it the financial gain that is driving them to go towards net zero?
Oh yes, okay. Well, I suppose yes and no, and it'll be on a context basis, I think. So there will be as always, when you have to do when you're trying to go about behavior change, you'll have your, I don't know, 1 or 2% kind of absolute trailblazers that are doing everything at their own expense and at all expenses. Then you'll have, I don't know, maybe another 10, 15% maybe that really want to do it and are really engaged in it. But they just need some more information, some more help. They need some more finance to or whatever it might be, to get them involved. And so those are the churches that are going to be really proactive. They'll be coming up with plans and they'll be doing funding applications and whichever else. Then you've got the big bulk of the rest of them that probably won't do anything until someone else does. That they're interested, but they want to see when everyone else has started to do things, once they've got a good case studies to follow, and they want to know that it's financially viable or whatever it might be. And so within that, you'll have spectrums, all churches all throughout that spectrum of space. So for some churches, it won't be necessarily financially viable to pour in thousands of pounds of upgrades to a building that's maybe only used a few times a year, in which case we'll need to explore different alternatives. If there's a congregation that maybe rotates between buildings, the usage of that building potentially is not going to be worth piling in a whole new heat pump and whichever else. But the other end of the spectrum is you could have another church that's used as a community hub, and actually the worshipping community maybe only uses it once a week, but the wider community is involved in it the whole time, in which case the business case, I think, is what the term that would be most commonly used is completely different.
Zarina and Paul, we're going to, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I mean, I'm loving it. I've got all sorts of thoughts in my head. One of them being just the fact that when you were talking about all the different ways that people are going to have to do things, the kind of global response, how we're going to have to work together as nations, because this is such a global problem, and that one nation gets it right and 20 get it wrong, and we're still in the same position. So that's it. It's been great.